Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School initiative. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I am your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, we have my conversation with Jessica Greenawalt, co-founder and executive director of the Arthur Project, a New York City-based nonprofit mentoring program focused on students in middle school. The Arthur Project taps into the professional pipeline of social workers to provide middle schoolers with professional, not volunteer, mentors. It's a double win. Mentors benefit by satisfying the clinical fieldwork for their degree by being a mentor with the Arthur Project, and the youth in the program gain essential academic, social, emotional, and mental health supports with an engaging and well-trained near-peer mentor.
If a young person experiences and internalizes that they matter to their mentor, they can start to feel that they maybe matter to themselves and to their wider community. And that feeling of mattering can lead to a feeling of power, that a young person has the power to make decisions about their own lives, but also to use that power to become sort of stewards of their own community.
In part one of our conversation, Jessica and I talk about how the Arthur Project got started, why it chose to focus on middle school age youth, the types of communities and schools the organization works in, the backgrounds of the students engaged in the program, and how they come to participate in it, how and why clinical social workers in training are drawn to and sign up to be a mentor in the program, the additional training the Arthur Project provides them that is specific to the mission of positive youth development, and how the organization is both impacting students now and building a workforce pipeline of talented social workers dedicated to youth and community empowerment in the future. In part two, we dive into the design of the Arthur Project's Therapeutic mentoring program, including how the mentors and students get matched, and how the programming evolved from individual mentoring relationships to also include group sessions with youth after school, and community service, recreational, and cultural activities on weekends. We also discuss the results the Arthur Project is seeing, including the powerful concept of mattering, providing an outlet for young people to positively affect change in their communities and in their schools, and some of the advantages the Arthur Project sees with shorter-term relationships between mentor and mentees with intentional pass-offs. We then talk about the Arthur Project's future plans to strategically scale its model in multiple ways. That's in just a little bit. Now, here's part one of my conversation with Jessica Greenawalt. Jessica, welcome to the podcast. I'm delighted to get the chance to talk with you.
Likewise, I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here to talk about the Arthur Project, but I really hate using the term unique. Everyone thinks they're unique in some way, but I'm going to use it here because I actually do think you all have some unique ways of serving and supporting young people that I'm excited to have you share with our listeners, particularly in how you leverage clinical social workers and combine that with mentoring in formal and structured ways. So I want to get into all that with you. But before we do, let's learn a bit about you, if we can. You have been at the Arthur Project since its founding, and leading up to that, you had been in the counseling and social work field, both in youth programs and in academic settings. And it looks like you were drawn to social work early on and have stuck with it. And I don't know if this is safe to say, and you can certainly correct me, but I've always thought of social work as one of those immensely imbalanced fields, which is to say that the needs far outweigh the investment and the capacity. So almost by definition, there is some nobility in people who take part in such fields. So in any case, what was your motivation in making this your life's work?
That's a sometimes difficult question to answer. I think part of it was definitely my lineage, if you will. My mom is actually a social worker herself, and I grew up in a household where social justice was often part of the conversation, both historically and currently. And I kind of always knew that I was going to end up in some kind of helping profession, and most likely social work. And that became a little bit clearer to me as I got older. directly after I went to college, I worked in the foster care system for a couple years as a group home manager. So I got the chance to work with teenagers that were in the foster care system in a residential setting. I ran a group home for up to 6 teenagers at a time in the Oakland area of California. And it was a pretty incredible experience, definitely one I was not equipped to handle at the tender age of 22. But it definitely, what's the word I'm looking for, helped to focus my interest in social work, mostly because it opened my eyes to the vast systemic inequities and problems that surround primarily youth of color, people of color. And so working in the group home, I kind of got a chance to see not only these awesome kids and develop relationships with them, a few who I still have really close relationships with who are now full-grown adults, but I saw firsthand the failures of the system and how it impacted those young people, their families, their caregivers, their parents, really their entire ecosystem. And so after I spent a couple of years in foster care, it became pretty clear to me that I wanted to go back to school to get my master's in social work and to continue direct service, but also really learn more about policy, how historically how policy has worked or not for certain populations, and to think about what I could do in my own future on a larger scale beyond the direct impact of direct service.
Well, let's get into the Arthur Project. Just tell us, why does it exist? How did it get started? And maybe importantly for our audience, why the focus on middle school age youth?
Yeah. So I was brought into the blossoming conversation about the Arthur Project when my other 2 co-founders, Jeff Muty and Liz Murray, were at the tail end of about a year's worth of research. I guess I'll back it up a little bit and say that Jeff Muty heard Liz Murray speak at an event. Liz spoke about her personal experiences that she had being a young homeless person in the Bronx. Ultimately, through really the vehicle of a number of relationships, mentoring relationships in particular, she was able to shift the trajectory of her life. She ultimately went to Harvard, now has a family, is doing really well. She's written a book and has spoken many times about her experience. Jeff heard her speak at an event, was really inspired by her story, and wanted to start a mentoring organization. Immediately, Liz said, we have a lot of work to do because there's a lot of mentoring organizations out there, and many of them are falling into similar pitfalls, are experiencing similar challenges. They are volunteer-based, that they are episodic, often sort of like recreation driven, that the adults in those mentoring relationships are oftentimes untrained, unequipped, ill-prepared to work with young people. And sort of most harmfully, we see the result that there's a lot of unanticipated endings in those relationships, both because of the youth and their feelings and the adults and their feelings. But it became pretty clear that these volunteer-based relationships, mentoring relationships, didn't work as well as maybe they were intended to. And that in order to have a successful mentoring relationship between a youth and an adult, especially a youth that is already facing systemic barriers like racism and other forms of oppression, that it was critically important that the adult that was going to work with them was equipped to do so, was getting supervision to do so. And not only that, the structure of the time they were going to spend together and the relationship that they had was intentional. And Liz and Jeff really learned, even before they brought me into the conversation, that there were a lot of potential challenges with mentoring relationships and starting a mentoring organization, and that they really wanted to get clear about what those challenges were so that we could specifically address those gaps. So they spent a lot of time meeting with thought leaders, academics, mentoring organization leaders to learn in detail about what these potential challenges were in order to avoid them. And that is where they conceived of the Arthur Project, which is about the time that I was brought into the conversation to help lift it off the ground as an organization. And during our time together, we realized that a few things needed to happen. One, that the adults that were going to be working with the young people we were going to serve were equipped to do so, were trained to do so, hence social work students, that there needed to be structure and supervision and intentionality behind the relationship and within the relationship, that it needed to operate from an anti-oppressive social justice perspective, and that the key was to empower young people through every avenue that we can, through every intervention that would be developmentally appropriate. So we developed this model, which the heart of it is really this one-on-one relationship, but there are also opportunities for group and community-based work, summer programming, etc., that really still feeds the social emotional needs and mental health needs of the young people we're serving in ways that are more fun and engaging and, like I said, sort of developmentally appropriate for a middle school student. The reason that we chose middle school, and we did choose middle school and design the model around the needs of middle school students, was for a couple reasons. One was, again, addressing a gap. We recognized that at that time, and this is now 2016, 2017, that middle school age programming is historically under-resourced compared to sort of earlier age or later age. You know, you hear a lot about early education, a lot about high school access, but middle school is sort of the missing group in terms of support services. And luckily, at the same time, it's a really wonderful time to be in a therapeutic relationship with a child because they are learning so much about themselves. They're growing, they're exploring, they're figuring things out, they're asking a lot of questions. Their cognitive abilities are evolving and are very malleable in so many wonderful ways. There's a lot of flexibility at that time. So it's a really great time to be part of a child's ecosystem and kind of be a trusted guide as they navigate the trials and tribulations of middle school that for most young people are challenging, even in the best case scenarios. So, yeah, we are specifically focused on middle school, and we're pretty proud of that. They also happen to be really fun kids. Like, I don't know if you know any middle school students, but they're a lot of fun. They've got a lot of really interesting stuff going on in their lives. They're on top of all the coolest trends. So it's definitely a fun age to be in support of a young person or young people.
Yes, we have a middle schooler at home and one who's now in high school, so has gone through that experience. And it's funny and interesting to hear you articulate the reasons why middle school, because when I was running a after-school program, middle school focused, I said almost identically what you had just articulated. It's an under-addressed time period. There's concentration on either ends of the educational spectrum, early childhood through workforce, and we're missing a great opportunity. Like, when you look at all the literature around adolescent development, youth development in general, this time period, particularly of early adolescence, is a great opportunity because it has lasting impact. The experiences that young people have at this age have a certain sense of stickiness. Like, the experiences that they have in this age range will stick with them for long periods of time. And we probably know that intuitively in our own experience at that age. So having more programming, more support at this age is kind of critically important. I personally would like to see more of it. You teed up some of the aspects of the programming, which I want to get in more detail on. But before we do that, you operate in New York. Paint us a picture, if you will, of the types of communities that you're currently working in and the background of the students that you're serving.
So we work specifically in communities and neighborhoods in New York City that are historically under-resourced, and we use a number of indicators to tell us that story, one of them being just the general census tracts and federal poverty levels, knowing where students and families are living. For our students, they are living at or below the federal poverty line. There's also other comparable indicators like being a Title I school, which means that most students qualify for free lunch, which again is a reflection of the poverty level that they are living in. And we also specifically seek out partnerships with community schools. Community schools in New York City are hubs of support and services through a model that is meant to address a number of historical challenges by really infusing communities with those resources and supports rather than shutting schools down, as was done not too long ago here in New York City. So from the start, we seek out partnerships where the community is living at or below the poverty line, maybe has experienced some historical challenges, and wants us there. You know, it's important to us that we're sort of invited in, that the communities that we're serving, the specific local communities that we're serving, recognize that they might want this kind of support, fun, therapeutic, mentoring relationship that is school-based. So that's another big piece of our decision around partnerships as well. Demographically, what it looks like is all of the students we serve are students of color. In our Bronx middle schools, most of the students are Black, African American, Caribbean American, Caribbean, and that is the case as well for our Brooklyn site. We also have a large group of kids who are Latino, Hispanic, again, Latino, Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean. We're definitely seeing more and more students who are enrolling mid-year because they are being bused up from the border. So we're seeing an increase in Spanish-speaking students and families. Again, the vast majority of our students are living at or below the poverty line.
Their access to the program, you mentioned you're part of kind of like the constellation of community school services, the broad array that happens in community schools. Do students opt in? Do you recruit them? How do they get into the program?
So a little bit of both. I don't know if I would call it lucky because I hope it's by design, but we have a lot of young people that want to be a part of our program. As the years go on of our partnerships with these middle schools, we have to do less recruiting because more students are self-referring, referring friends, or staff and teachers, guidance counselors are referring those students. So as time has gone on, it's been less work for us to identify students that would benefit from the program. In fact, we have waiting lists at all of our school sites and are oversubscribed, which is a good problem to have, but a problem I definitely like to address. And so we have a good bunch that are actually self-referred. The programming that we offer includes time with a mentor, individual time that's really focused on that young person. But we also have these other group activities that go on after school, during lunch, on Saturdays during the summer that get opened up to all students in the school. So we find sometimes that a student might come in and participate in like a workshop or something with us and then say, hey, can I get a mentor? So there's a lot of different avenues for students to become engaged in our programming. But in general, we're looking at 3 indicators of eligibility: that they have unmet academic engagement needs, which can look like attendance challenges, challenges with content in school, challenges with relationships with peers or teachers, unmet behavioral needs that might cause academic challenges. And then we're also looking at kids who have unmet social emotional needs and or unmet mental health needs, which if you think about all 3 of those indicators, academic, social emotional, mental health, is essentially every young person right now. So there's no shortage of young people that would benefit from our program. And we find that because they're essentially being provided therapeutic services through the umbrella of this really fun, engaging relationship with somebody who likes being with them, is cool, is often sort of a young adult that they can look up to that looks very similar to them. We find that in many ways we've destigmatized access to mental health services by providing them through this therapeutic mentoring umbrella. And so we find that the kids are really excited to be part of our program for the most part. Of course, we have kids that need to test it out, or they're like, who are you? What do you want? What are we doing here? And we respect that. We get that.
And you mentioned you're part of kind of like the constellation of community school services. Do students opt in? Do you recruit them? How do they get into the program?
Yeah, so there's the piece about the discipline, right? We're talking about folks who are social workers in training, clinicians in training, who have already made a decision to pursue this path to uplift voices that maybe have historically been marginalized, to leverage their own privilege, to create access and opportunity for others, to develop a specific skill set that is housed in a person and environment perspective. So people who are trained to think about systems and how systems impact youth or adults on an individual basis. So we're already starting from a certain orientation, a certain ideology that we think is critical and really compels us to utilize social work students to be in these relationships with these young people. We also have our own criteria in that we recognize that these are social work students. They are students. This is a learning experience for them. They're not going to be able to operate, most of them, at the level of a professional social worker. They need a lot of guidance. We give them a lot of supervision, a lot of professional development opportunities, but we also prioritize bringing on social work students who have had previous experience with the population, with young adults, middle school age children who have shared lived experience with the young people that we're serving. Many of the mentors that we take on grew up in New York City, went to public New York City schools, are from the neighborhoods that we're serving, if not very close by. And it's really important to us that when we bring in mentors and we have a really rigorous screening process, that they are not only equipped to work with young people of this age in this setting, but are really excited to do so. We want people who like being with this age, are excited about the possibility of supporting a young person in this age group, and are willing to be in a pretty challenging environment. So we kind of have our own standards that elevate the quality of the pool of candidates that come to us as mentors beyond even becoming social workers or having that orientation towards social justice.
Well, I definitely want to talk about some of the group work that you do and community work, but let's talk about the individual stuff first. But as I mentioned, one of the key differentiators that I've seen in the Arthur Project, in one of the reasons I've been interested in it and have been following your work, is what you described as a sort of non-volunteer mentors that you hire. But not that they're non-volunteer mentors, but rather that they have a specific professional and clinical background. And I think that's one of the key features here. So let's talk about the people first, and then we'll talk about the programming. Share just a little bit about the profile of the mentors that you hire, their backgrounds, and why that is especially valuable for youth of this age range and the mentoring relationships that you're working to foster.
Yeah, so we have really close working relationships with all of the local schools of social work and a growing group of remote programs. So programs where students are going to classes online but have to fulfill this practicum requirement, this internship requirement in person. And so all of those folks that would come to us through that avenue live in New York City but are just going to school online, perhaps at Boston University or Denver University, for example. So we're pretty unusual in that our service delivery model is set up so that the majority of our services are being provided through these social work students, and that a lot of the process of getting social work students year over year relies on a good reputation, relies on our previous social work students feeling like they had a good experience, that they learned social work skills, clinical skills, that they enjoyed the relationships with the kids, that they feel prepared to enter the field as a competent, culturally responsive social worker. So we're really dedicated to creating that learning experience for the social work students so that they speak highly of us and tell their classmates and colleagues, so other students want to come learn from us as well. In fact, we've really grown to see ourselves as a training institute for social workers and are trying now to explore fundraising and development opportunities through sort of workforce development streams, if you will, something that's kind of new for us, but makes sense because we are so dedicated and structured around these social work students and meeting their needs.
Yeah, when you think of the more established programs, the ones that have been around for a long time, the TFAs, where they're trying to impact students in the classroom, but also building this sort of pipeline of talent. Breakthrough Collaborative is another one that I talk about a lot, and they had a similar sort of approach more in the out-of-school sector. So I definitely see the advantages where you have maybe a lane there where you're talking about the ongoing sort of professional development and growth and pipeline of young people who are pursuing this field in addition to immediately driving impact for students. That was Jessica Greenawalt, co-founder and executive director of the Arthur Project. In part 2 of our conversation, we dive into the design of the Arthur Project's Therapeutic mentoring program, how the individual mentoring relationships developed into group sessions with youth after school and on weekends, the results the Arthur Project is seeing, including the powerful concept of mattering, providing an outlet for young people to positively affect change in their communities and in their schools, and some of the advantages the Arthur Project is seeing with shorter-term relationships between mentor and mentees with intentional pass-offs, and how the Arthur Project plans to scale its model in multiple ways. That's coming up in just a little bit on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I spoke with Jason Sachs, president of Positive Coaching Alliance. For more than 25 years, PCA has worked to instill research and best practice in positive youth development into youth sports. There are more than 30 million young people participating in youth sports in the United States, although there are significant differences in access across communities, which is why a big part of PCA's work is to advocate for greater equity in youth sports. PCA also offers training and resources to coaches, officials, parents, and youth to overcome the significant gaps in knowledge and capacity around positive youth development in youth sports.
There's either a lack of trained coaches or lack of coaches in general. Or there might be, hey, great, you volunteered, you said you might be able to help out. Now you're the head coach and you might not have any experience, not only of the sport, But now let's talk about like youth development experience and how to manage and, work with and have that connection with kids that could be ranging from 6 years old through high school. A lot of people aren't equipped to deal with that, and their default might be, how was I coached when I was growing up, which 30 years, we don't necessarily want those practices, or what do I see on TV? And college and professional sports are entertainment. It's a completely different ballgame. Yes, there are some great things we can pull from some of those coaches, but a lot of that, it's a different outcome and goal that they're shooting for that what we should be shooting for at the youth and high school sports level.
You can listen to all my conversation with Jason on a previous episode. And now, here is part 2 of my conversation with Jessica Greenawalt. Let's pivot from the mentors themselves and talk about your approach to mentoring and just the mentoring process and the mentoring relationships. Mentoring runs the gamut in terms of the duration of the relationship, the nature of the interactions. Many of these are what we would call informal mentoring, which certainly has its value. It's not to be discounted, but you, as you mentioned, have this particular informal approach to mentoring. So tell us about that, the design of the mentoring.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say that, our design is evidence-based in that we learned from many other programs and from the literature on mentoring, on youth development. And it's evidence-based in the sense that we really value our stakeholder community, the kids, their caregivers, our school staff. So we are constantly soliciting feedback and input from the young people, from their parents and caregivers to refine and shape our model to be responsive to them. As an example, in our first year, we envisioned that the young people in our program would spend a great deal of time with their mentors, like 20 hours a week, in school, after school, on the weekends. And as the first year of programming went on, what we found was that the young people really wanted to be with their mentors. They enjoyed being with their mentors, who, by the way, they have agency in choosing. So at the beginning of each year, we have opportunities for mentors and kids to meet, and the kids actually get to determine who they get matched with. So we were finding that the kids were really excited and really wanted to be with their mentor, but as most 12 or 13-year-olds feel, they don't want to spend 20 hours a week with really any adult. It doesn't matter how cool or awesome you are. That's a lot of one-on-one time between sort of an early teen and an adult. And so we were hearing the kids say oh yeah, I want to come after school, but can I bring a friend? And we're like, yeah, of course. Of course, the 13-year-old wants to hang out with their friends. Their social experience is everything at this age. So we kind of followed the kids' lead, and out of that, we developed small group work. So instead of meeting individually after school or on the weekends, there were opportunities for small and large group work. And during the school day, really centered around different kind of healing modalities. So we really take something that's of interest to the kids, like anime, for example, and then we infuse it with modalities of art or movement and use that theme to create more opportunities for healing, for exploration, for pro-social engagement with peers, for rehearsing of maybe new skills that they're learning when they're in that one-on-one relationship with their mentor. And then on Saturdays, we curate a selection of activities, mostly out in the city. It's a combination of service opportunities, of recreational opportunities, of cultural opportunities, so that the young people can spend some time in a group setting with mentors, but also with friends, doing something that they probably wouldn't otherwise have access to. So there's flexible levels of participation for our young people. If they agree to be in our program, they're agreeing to, at the very least, meet with their mentor once a week, perhaps twice. And then all other aspects of our programming, the small group work, the Saturday community-based work, are optional for them.
And you articulated in some of your material these phases that you call mattering. Tell us a little bit about that framework and why that's important.
Yeah, so we value and recognize the impact that we have on one another, and that relationships can really be a vehicle for somebody internalizing a sense of mattering to others, which is sort of a conduit for change in itself. It's also an outcome that we measure. We measure if our young people feel that they matter, and we have articulated, this isn't a full sort of theory of change, but we do have this more informal theory of change, which is the idea that if a young person experiences and internalizes that they matter to their mentor, they can start to feel that they maybe matter to themselves and to their wider community. And that feeling of mattering can lead to a feeling of power, that a young person has the power to make decisions about their own lives, but also to use that power to become sort of stewards of their own community. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we used to hear young people or young people's families say, when you grow up, it'll be great if you can get out of this neighborhood, if you can leave this area. And I get that. I understand that perspective. But what we really want is for our young people to leave us with the tools, the feeling of power that they can make positive change in their own lives and in the lives of the people around them.
It's interesting. When I was running this program called Spark, it was also formal mentoring, although they were volunteers, and they would work on projects together. And we would take the students to places of business, and part of it was to experience like the working world and get sort of inspired and so forth. We had programs in different cities and so forth, and a similar profile of students that you serve. The projects that they were interested in doing with their mentor, so many of them were connected to making some sort of difference or some sort of positive change in their own community. Maybe this is a natural youth thing, but to have the desire to want to work on things that have social meaning within their own community, I found really sort of powerful that they opted into. I thought it was really interesting you said about having the agency to choose their mentor. In our case, it was like choosing the project that they wanted to work on. But there does seem to be this really profound sense among a lot of young people in places that have been underserved and where there's injustice to want to really rectify that and use opportunities to do that. And it sounds like you're finding some similar things.
Absolutely. I think it's really such a wonderful time to have these conversations with young people because developmentally they're just getting out of that self-centered stage. And I mean that in a non-judgmental way. I mean that in the strictly sort of like cognitive social development sense. They're emerging out of this phase where they're very turned in and sort of only seeing themselves and sort of starting to look out to peers, to look out to their family, to their history, their culture. I think it is kind of naturally happening at that time that they're starting to see themselves as part of this larger ecosystem. And I do think that there is maybe an intrinsic drive to be powerful in that space. At the same time, I think that a lot of young people, especially young people of color, young people who are living in poverty, get a lot of messages that they don't have power, that they're not in control. Even our schools, the principals and teachers and guidance counselors and all the staff in our schools that we work with are fantastic. But in reality, the institution of formal public education is really not designed to give young people control over their lives or their trajectory. And that's literal and figurative, you know? You just should kind of stay in your lane as a young person, especially as a young person of color. I think that that's the messages that they get a lot of the time. And so it is a really great time to intervene and to say, no, there are avenues for you to enact your power. Here's where I see that you're powerful. That's part of the reason that we combine the individual with the group work, because the individual work is so critically important, where it is just about that young person. It's about helping them figure out who they want to be, where they want to go, and most importantly, how they're going to get there. But in the group setting, you get to do those things and enact that power that you've been developing in that individual relationship with your mentor.
I was interested in your comments around the picture of the in-school environment and what you're trying to do. And it's not meant to comment on the individual motivations or performance of the counselors and the teachers and so forth. But it does speak to this issue of structures. And what we talk about a lot is this concept of being mismatched, that the educational system as it's currently designed and structured is not in sync with the developmental, basic human development of what young people need. And so one way to address that is to change the structure. But we all know that is a heavy lift. That's like a 30-year project in most cases. I think in the near term, the kids of today don't have time to wait 30 years. They're only in middle school a certain time. And the educators themselves have certain accountabilities, certain things that they have to do, and they don't have space. Now, you want them to make sure that they're set up not to run completely counter to what you're trying to do. But there is a complementarity there that I think could be grown and fostered and scaled by this kinds of partnerships that you're talking about with the schools and also these out-of-school partners.
For sure. We do see ourselves increasingly being influential in the school culture and school climate, especially as the staff and teachers in our partner schools are seeing the impact of our programming and buying in more to what we do, they're increasingly receptive to alternative ways of being in relationship with young people. And sometimes that looks like a systemic change on a school level or a classroom level. Sometimes it looks like working with an individual teacher. Ultimately, as social workers, we want the people that we work with to be advocates for themselves and to have the tools and the information to be self-advocates. At the same time, these are kids we're talking about. There is a power dynamic at play here that we can't ignore. And it does require us as adults to sometimes step in on their behalf, to advocate for them, to mediate for them, to be a supportive voice. You know, I think about kids who have been suspended, kids who have IEPs that are not being met. The various challenges that could arise where if a young person is representing themselves or maybe with their caregiver, that can be a really intimidating experience. So when we are invited to do so by the kids, by their caregivers, we do step in. We try to be a part of those conversations so that we can use our influence to address some of these systemic issues, including the teachers. So we use restorative practices within our programming. And what that looks like is a recognition that when a young person acts up, if you will, it's a reflection of an imbalance in the community, an imbalance in the environment. And so our goal is to restore balance, to keep that young person as part of our community, keep them engaged and keep them active, which is counter to the way most schools are handling sort of disruptive behaviors. So, you know, there are ways that we do have the strength of relationship to be able to positively affect the school climate or culture.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about results. You mentioned some of them earlier, but one of the pieces that I was really interested in is your philosophy around the duration of the mentoring relationships. And part of this is probably the cycle of the students that you bring on to do their mentoring and as part of their clinical experience. But as I understand it, you intentionally actually set them up as one-year arrangements. And I've done a bit of work with Mentor, which is the field building and advocacy and support umbrella organization for the mentoring field. And as you probably know, in their seminal report, The Mentoring Effect, they put forth that longer-term mentoring relationships are more impactful. Your experience seems to run a bit counter to that narrative, and it seems like you're seeing some advantages, maybe that are especially tuned to young adolescent development in these shorter relationships. Maybe say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think in short, it's nuanced. I believe the data that says that longer relationships are more impactful. And for that reason, we design our model to be such that a student enrolls with us in 6th grade and stays with us through the duration of middle school. Some students are with us for 7th and 8th grade, but we actually specifically don't take in new 8th graders for this exact reason. I believe that we're seeing some of the impact that you would see in longer term relationships with a single adult through this model. And again, there's sort of caveats and nuances to that. One of them is that our kids know that they're going to have a different mentor each year. So some of the lack of impact or even negative outcomes that other relationships or organizations experience is really due to that unanticipated ending. The harm that's done when an adult pulls back because it's not working, that's where we see those really negative outcomes. And because there's transparency around the opportunity to have really 3 different mentors through the duration of middle school, that expectation around the relationship mitigates a lot of that harm. I'll say, though, we were concerned about it. You know, the data does show that. So we did ask ourselves, like, is this the right thing to do? And in our first couple of years, it was a bit of a pilot question of whether or not it was going to be impactful. And what we found is between the shared expectation around the relationship ending, the student having agency over who they're matched with year over year, we're seeing that the young people actually have like an opportunity to complement the experiences that they had with previous mentors. I mean, all things being considered equal, your first mentor you could love and they're absolutely fabulous and you achieved all your goals and did everything you want. Your second mentor, maybe you don't have that strong of a connection. So the opportunity to experience a relationship with 3 different mentors allows for some compensation, if you will, for maybe opportunities that just didn't happen happen in one particular relationship. And there's a lot of continuity between those relationships. We really spend a lot of time supporting the transition from one mentor to another so that when a new mentor steps in, they've got the information they need so they can understand, okay, I know what this kid was doing, what the priorities were, what they were up to, what the challenges and successes were, and I have an idea about where I can step in to offer a complementary and enhanced experience.
Yeah, that's kind of where my head was going too, is that time period notoriously is a time period where you're constantly creating all these transition points for kids. In typical education systems in this country anyway, you have your elementary grades and then you pass them off to a middle school. Sometimes there's actually two types of middle schools, and then you pass them off to high school. So all of those pass-offs, again, this is where kind of the mismatch happens. This pass-off is happening at the exact time when young people are heavily influenced by their social environments, their relationships. And sometimes those pass-offs, when they're not done properly or without intention, can bring out some of the vulnerabilities that people face. And so where my head was going is that you're actually building a skill. You're actually building into them by being transparent, as you said, being intentional to say, this is what it means and this is what it's like to move from one relationship to another. In which, by the way, you're going to have to do that throughout your entire life. And certainly in the next stage of your education, you're going to go to high school. There's different teachers, the next grade, different teachers, etc. You have to learn how to do that. I even tell my own kids, you're going to like certain teachers and you're not going to like certain teachers, but regardless, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to navigate and be successful. So I like this idea of building into a model where you're actually building that skill with intention.
And I'll say that that's balanced by our program staff, the majority of whom are licensed social workers themselves. They are sort of the permanent anchors for our kids. And again, the continuity of the model as a whole, our idea is to really promote engagement with us as an organization as there are these transitions of mentors and mentoring relationships. But our program staff are really critical components to that because they are that familiar face that when we come back in September, and a kid comes in and says, who's my mentor going to be this year? That there's a familiar face that they can ask that question to and get an answer.
So where is TAP going from here? You're still a relatively young organization, as I mentioned. You have some unique features, as we mentioned, to your model that distinguish you in the field. What's on the horizon for you in the organization?
We're actually about to finalize a 3-year strategic plan. This is the second time we've developed a strategic plan. The first one was a few years ago and was a year-long plan during COVID and all the other social unrest that was happening at that point. But now we're a bit more established, especially that we've completed a year-long program evaluation that was based on the theory of change we developed. It showed that ethically we can say, okay, we think we know what we're doing a little bit here. And so I think that what the future is going to look like for the Arthur Project is kind of two paths. One is, expanding our direct services to maximize the impact of our direct services in New York City in particular and potentially beyond. And it's also to really think about the second path for the Arthur Project beyond our direct services is thinking about and positioning ourselves as thought leaders, thinking about how we can kind of harness the data that we've gathered, connect with other providers, other people who are engaged in youth development work, and how we can kind of scale our model beyond the direct service component. So that's something that we're really excited to explore. Again, we're also really looking deep into this workforce development component as well, now that we're institutionalizing ourselves as this sort of training hub for emerging social workers and thinking about how we can become part of the landscape in New York City in particular of training and supporting and preparing emerging social workers for the field and the many demands and populations and settings, especially here. So I think there's a lot on the horizon for us, and I'm excited to be able to articulate and finalize kind of those strategic priorities for us in the years ahead.
Well, I'm excited for you, Jessica. It's terrific to get a chance to talk with you and to learn more about TAP. Congratulations on all of you've accomplished so far, and I'll be eager to keep tabs on your future. So thanks for coming on the podcast to share with us.
Thanks.
That was Jessica Greenawalt, co-founder and executive director of The Arthur Project. You can learn more about The Arthur Project on the web at thearthurproject.org or on social media by searching The Arthur Project on Facebook, Twitter X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast and Remaking Middle School are products of Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia Center for Effective Youth Development, which you can visit online at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, N-E-X, or on Facebook and YouTube at Youth-Nex, and on Twitter X and Instagram at Youth_Nex. Lessons in Adolescence is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Sophia Moore. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website or on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.